Here it is, guys, the final week of King of Hearts. It's taken by our good friend Rob Mason, so buckle up for an awesome message.
Hi guys, it's good to be with you again and a real honor to close our series, King of Hearts. We've been looking at the life of David, and I really like David for a number of reasons. One of them is because he was this real blokey guy, warrior, outdoor shepherd, but at the same time he was a muso and a songwriter and a bit of poetry in the side. I think, wow, very secure in his masculinity. So this last message is all about a quality that I really admire in people, and that is dedication. David had a dedicated heart. But before we look at David, think about some of the people you admire because of their dedication. You know, their life is very disciplined, very focused. There's a tenacity. I think of Billy Graham, the great evangelist, his dedication to preaching the gospel all over the world. Then there's a Nelson Mandela and many others like him, dedicated to justice and equality and a reformed South Africa. Closer to home, we have the late Steve Irwin and his family continuing his legacy and his dedication to wildlife and conservation. Here in Perth, we have the two Fionas, Fiona Stanley, Fiona Wood, both dedicated to healthcare and medical research. I admire people who are 100% dedicated. So let's look at the life of David, this man who had a dedicated heart. David was dedicated to his father's sheep. When David was anointed by the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 16 to replace a fallen king, King Saul, we read that David went back to his sheep. He's just been appointed king, and it's, well, thank you very much, Samuel. I'm going back to the sheep. He didn't go to the leadership academy to learn to be king. He didn't parade himself around Jerusalem saying to everyone, hey, I've just been appointed king. Yeah, you bow down right now. He didn't even plot to assassinate King Saul, which would be a practice in more ancient times of leadership. If you were the new king, you get rid of the old king and his family. No, after his appointment to be the new king of Israel, David just went back to his father's sheep. They weren't his sheep. It was his father's sheep. Have you ever rented a house, ever hired a car? Recently in Sydney, visiting my daughter, I had to hire a car, and it's great. It was a brand new car, 1,500 kilometres. It was very wet. There was a lot of potholes in the road. There were a couple of times I hit a pothole really badly, harshly, and it was, it's no biggie. It's not my car. I returned the car. It was dirty. There was sand, all the carpet, but hey, it's not my issue. It's not my car. Well, that wasn't David's issue when it came to sheep. He didn't think, well, it's not my sheep. It's only my father's sheep. If there was a lost sheep, you think, nah, it's only one sheep. The old man won't notice. If there was a sheep slowing the herd down because, they had a really sore foot, he might think, I might just toss this sheep over the cliff because, hey, it's not mine, it's my dad's. No, David, he was totally dedicated to caring for his father's sheep. And for David, caring for his father's sheep and his dedication that he exhibited was not wasted time. It was actually preparation time. David's preparation for being the king of Israel was dedicating first to being one who looks after his father's sheep. A life of obscurity, monotony, and solitude. He was a man unknown, unappreciated, and unapplauded. I think that's the word. It is now. And so, look after sheep, maybe today it's a little easier with drones and helicopters and whatnot, but back then, looking after sheep, you're out in the open, you're exposed to wild weather, you're exposed to wild animals. There was even a time David said to Saul, hey, your servant has killed both lion and bear after his father's sheep, but David was dedicated. So a couple of lessons from this point. To be dedicated, okay, I don't know if any of you are shepherds, but to be dedicated in the workplace or in a school or university, wherever it is, it involves being punctual, diligent, helpful, reliable. You're loyal. You do your very best to contribute to a very positive work environment, because we have the idea or that sense that we are working unto the Lord. You might think, yeah, but it's not my business. But it's not, no, that's not the point. Like David, if we're going to have a heart that is dedicated, we don't choose the areas we're dedicated in and the areas we're not dedicated in. Here's another lesson. If we can't be dedicated in the little things, chances are we're not going to be dedicated in the big things. If we can't look after sheep, such as a shepherd, well, we probably can't look after people or a nation and to be a king. David was dedicated to his father's sheep. He was also dedicated to King Saul. A little bit about King Saul. He'd been appointed by Samuel to be the very first king in Israel, yet it didn't take him long, because of ego, pride, for him to disobey some instructions. As a result, God's empowering presence left King Saul, and it was replaced with this tormenting evil spirit. While David is looking after his father's sheep, there was an opportunity for him to also serve in Saul's palace as a muso. So when an evil spirit came upon Saul, it was almost a sense, David, David, and David would get out his harp and start playing, and then Saul would think, feel much better, and this evil spirit would leave. So here is David looking after his father's sheep and playing the harp for a fallen king, even though he's been appointed the king of Israel. David was dedicated to a fallen king. But over a period of time, David became more prominent and more popular. And then Saul became consumed with jealousy, resentment, and rage. He even attempted to kill David on a number of occasions. As a result of that, David had no choice but to flee and to be a fugitive in the wilderness for about 13 years. Despite a number of opportunities, when Saul is pursuing David in the wilderness, David had a number of opportunities to kill Saul, but he still viewed Saul as the Lord's anointed one. David was dedicated to a fallen king. Here's a lesson. Dedication doesn't guarantee respect, recognition, or an easy life. You may be dedicated to aspects of the environment, or you could be dedicated to medicine or to the arts, and along the way people may misunderstand you. I've recently dedicated my life to eating just plants, and I'm not militant about it. I don't tell people what they should be doing, but every now and then, particularly with men, they'll say, "You're a vegetarian." Well, yeah, I mean, real men eat meat. I mean, men have been eating meat for millenniums, and where do you get your protein? And it's just part, look, I'm dedicated to this particular lifestyle, but along the way, there are times people may misunderstand you. And that's a real test. This area of dedication. Am I absolutely dedicated that I can deal with misunderstanding and a few people perhaps misrepresenting me? As a pastor, I had authority because I was under authority. And not just the authority of God, but the authority of God through a church board. I had an overseer, I had a spiritual mentor, I had a number of men and women who I dedicated my life to. I wanted their wisdom, I wanted accountability. Today, I'm just a mere member of a local church, but nothing's changed. Still dedicated to this church, to their mission, and especially to the lead pastors. See, it's not about being dedicated when you're the boss. It's being dedicated when you serve, when you're part of the company. David was dedicated to Israel. One of the most defining moments in his life was when he killed Goliath, this huge mountain of a man. He was a Philistine. He was one of the enemies of Israel. And there was a time when David is looking after the sheep and playing a bit of music for Saul. He heard the ranting of this man, the insults he was putting on God's people, the disgrace he was sort of projecting onto Israel. And David had enough. I mean, everyone else is in fear, but David went to Saul and said, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him," because David is dedicated to God and the nation of Israel. Saul, after trying everything possible to say, "Hey, that may not be a good idea, or if you are going to go, take my armor," David said, no, let me just go with a few stones. And Saul said, "Well, go and the Lord be with you." Goliath came with the sword, the spear, and the javelin, but we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 45, I love this, "But David came in the name of the Lord Almighty." He had 5 stones. One did the job. And when David did finally become king, he also wanted to find a house, a temple for God. He had this heart for this nation. And he's looking around, it's like, I've got a palace, I've got a home. People of Israel, they've got homes. Where is God's home? It's this tabernacle, this big tent. And so David was dedicated to having a place in Jerusalem, this center of worship where people can come and worship God. Well, that assignment will eventually be given to his son Solomon, but you can see David wasn't just content to be king and just to be popular and honored. It was like, no, this place, this nation needs a temple. As a summary of David's life in 1 King chapter 2, verse 11, we read that David reigned for 40 years. He defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, and the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So he didn't just maintain this nation that he inherited from King Saul, he expanded the boundaries. So what does dedication to our nation look like? I'm not going to offer any suggestions. I want you to take your time. What does I live here in Australia? Maybe you were born here, maybe you came from another country, but what does it mean to be dedicated to a nation? Well, let's move on. David was dedicated to Jonathan. David's closest friend, we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, was Jonathan, ironically, the son of Saul, this fallen king who was pursuing David to kill him. When David heard of Jonathan's death, he said, and it's recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26, David said of Jonathan, "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of a woman." Now, David had a lot of women in his life, and he's not saying he's fluid in his sexuality. He's saying that Jonathan, there was something that he had with Jonathan, and an intimacy, a closeness that often men experience, especially in battle. When you're in battle and you're covering each other, there's a closeness, a bond that becomes unbreakable. But what David does at this point is, he's succeeding, he's expanding the boundaries of Israel, but there's a sense of there's unfinished business. And David realizes what this feeling is. He says, I need to show kindness as a way of honoring my closest friend, Jonathan. Now, I briefly mentioned this before, but at this time, in ancient times, if you're the new king and you defeat a nation or a number of nations, you would either kill the kings unless they've been killed before, in battle, but you'd also go after the sons and the daughters because you don't want anyone in that family ever avenging their death. But not David. He's not thinking of who can I assassinate. He's thinking, who can I show favor to honor this love and this dedication I have for Jonathan. And then he learnt that Jonathan had a son who was in hiding, and David knows what it's like to be in hiding. The son's name was Mephibosheth, and very basically what had happened with Mephibosheth was when he was about 5 years old, the enemies were coming, the babysitter at the time grabbed him very quickly, dropped him accidentally, and both of his feet were broken, they never healed, and so he was lame in both feet. David eventually found Mephibosheth. He restored all the land and assets from his father Jonathan and his grandfather Saul. So all of a sudden, Mephibosheth, living as a fugitive, is now living with all of this prosperity, but there's more. David said, Mephibosheth, I want you to eat at my table with my sons and my daughters. You are family. So what can we learn about David's dedication to a friend? We are called not just to be dedicated to a mission or a cause, we are called to be dedicated to family and friends, to believe the best and draw out the best, to forgive, to seek to understand, to honor, to celebrate, to party, to do life with. As I bring this message to a close, I want us now to look at the dark side of dedication. This heading is not a reflection of the value of dedication, but rather the frailty of humanity. If we were to look at Jesus, he was perfectly and completely dedicated to his Father's mission, to usher in the kingdom of God from heaven to earth, to destroy the works of the devil. Yet at the same time, Jesus was also dedicated to his family, to his friends, to his disciples, to the marginalized, to the poor, to the people within Israel, the people outside of Israel. He was dedicated to the temple to the point that one time he threw out all of the religious leaders, turning over tables because it became a marketplace, a place of greed, a place of excluding seekers who were not Jewish people. He was passionate in all areas of his life. His dedication led him to a cross. But for us, we can be so dedicated, especially to a mission or a cause, that we fail to be dedicated to other areas in our life that are also important. And so David had his blind spots, dedicated to his father's sheep, dedicated to Israel, dedicated to being a king, dedicated to being a warrior, dedicated to his close friend Jonathan. And yet he had his blind spots. He wasn't always dedicated to kingdom morals, to marriage, and to family. And even though we've already addressed an aspect of David's life, of his affair with Bathsheba, we have to go there again because it really was the turning point in David's life. And there were things happening before that time that made him vulnerable, that David was responsible for. But as a result of this incident with Bathsheba and what he had to do to cover his mistakes, his sin, we begin to see this downhill spiral where there was trouble in the home. To think that David could skillfully and courageously build a powerful nation, yet in many aspects he failed to build a strong family. And in 2 Samuel chapters 13 to 18, we see that even though David was forgiven for committing adultery, which was at that time under the law, especially as a king, punishable by death, he had experienced the grace of God, he was forgiven, but the sin still had consequences. Dedicated to a nation, but not dedicated to morals, not dedicated to marriage, and not dedicated to his family. And here's a snapshot of what happened within his family over a number of years. Amnon raped his sister Tamar. Tamar, the daughter of David. Absalom, David's son, kills his brother Amnon. Absalom revolts against his father David. David again has to flee Jerusalem. Absalom has sex with David's concubines on the rooftop. In other words, he did it in a very public manner, and Absalom was eventually killed in battle. The prophet Nathan was right when he said, "The sword would never depart from David's house." This is a tough one. So here is a lesson. And we can learn from the tragedy, especially of recent fallen Christian leaders. People who were dedicated to building the church, to preaching the gospel, to planting other churches all over the world, and yet they compromised dedication to holiness, their marriage, family, spiritual disciplines, and their own well-being. And I know what it's like on both sides. My father was dedicated to being a pastor of a local church, and at the age of about 15 or 16, struggling with my relationship with my father, I remember thinking to myself, I would have more of my father's time and affection if I was a member of his church than simply being his son. There were times as a pastor of a church for 23 years, I had to be very careful. At times I actually found it easier to be dedicated to building the local church than building into my own wife and son and daughter. At times I would come home after a busy day ministering to all of these people, and yet I just felt I had nothing left to give. And then I remembered my father, and I thought, I don't want my children ever having those feelings. And so I had to work hard of having that sense of balance, of being dedicated to this calling of being a pastor of a local church. But that never required me. God never expected me to compromise my dedication to my marriage, to my wife, and being a father to my children. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, you've covered the life of David very well, dedicated to his father's sheep and dedicated to the nation and dedicated to Jonathan. But you haven't really mentioned, there hasn't been a separate heading, David's dedication to God, and that was intentional. One thing we've learned over this series, and you've probably heard it over and over again, that David was a man after God's own heart. He was a worshipper. He would pray, he would meditate on scripture, he wrote psalms, he wrote spiritual songs. But when I see this idea of being dedicated to God, I don't see it as this separate part of our life. That all of life is spiritual. And to be dedicated to God is to be dedicated, for those of us who are married, to be dedicated in marriage, to be dedicated to our siblings, to be dedicated to our children, to be dedicated to our pastors, to be dedicated to the local church, to be dedicated to our environment, to be dedicated to the marginalized, to be dedicated to all things, because all things are spiritual. So let's close by looking at some of the Psalms that David wrote as a worshipper, as a man who was dedicated in so many areas and yet also flawed in a number of areas. But let's look at this man after God's own heart. If you're ever feeling distress, David wrote in Psalm 4 verse 1, "Answer me when I call you, O my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Be merciful to me and hear my prayer." Anyone needing confidence? Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. Longing for the presence of God, Psalm 27, verse 4. One thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. Yes, David, a worshipper's heart, restored heart, a heart of loyalty, a heart of dedication. David was a man after God's own heart. But let me close this series with this phrase. And God's heart is dedicated to you. God's peace and grace be upon you. Cheers.